the first thing the monster ever learned about humanity was how to be afraid of it. The emergency siren screamed through Deck 9 of the Helios Station as red warning lights pulsed across the steel corridors in slow, dying waves. Cold air hissed from overloaded vents. Somewhere deep behind the reinforced walls, a containment alarm repeated the same sentence over and over in 3 separate languages. Psychic event detected. Containment breach possible. All personnel evacuate immediately. Ethan Cole stepped out of the maintenance elevator carrying a rusted tool case in one hand and a thermal coffee flask in the other. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his gray eyes, and the sleeves of his work jacket were stained with grease from a 12-hour repair shift in the station's lower reactor ring. He barely even reacted to the alarms anymore. On Helios, something was always broken. A pair of armed security officers rushed past him toward the upper corridor, their black combat armor reflecting the crimson emergency lights. One of them noticed Ethan heading the opposite direction and immediately slowed down. "Hey," the officer barked. "Maintenance route's closed. Turn around." Ethan frowned slightly. "Oxygen scrubbers on cell block C are failing again. Dispatch sent me." The second guard exchanged a nervous glance with his partner. "Nobody's supposed to go near 47 right now." Ethan adjusted the weight of the tool case in his hand. "Then maybe somebody should fix the ventilation before the whole level smells like burnt wiring for the next month." Neither guard laughed. The older one stepped closer instead, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully, maintenance guy. Don't look directly at her. Don't speak to her. Don't let her speak to you. Get in, fix the panel, and get out." Ethan stared at him for a second. "Who?" The silence that followed felt heavier than the steel walls around them. Finally, the younger guard muttered the answer quietly. "The monster." The lights flickered overhead. Somewhere farther down the corridor, metal groaned like a ship sinking beneath dark water. Ethan walked alone through the checkpoint scanner after the guards. Unlocked the blast doors remotely. The deeper levels of Helios always felt colder than the rest of the station. Less human. Thick pipes lined the ceiling, dripping condensation onto grated floors. Reinforced observation windows stretched along the hallway, though every single one had been sealed shut behind heavy titanium shutters. Cell 47 sat at the very end of the corridor. Even before Ethan reached it, he noticed the damage. Scorch marks blackened the walls outside the containment chamber. One of the ceiling lights hung loose by exposed wiring, swinging gently back and forth. A medical stretcher had been abandoned near the doorway, overturned on its side. Ethan crouched beside the ventilation panel and plugged in his diagnostic scanner. Pressure levels unstable. Oxygen filtration offline. Internal temperature 43 degrees Fahrenheit. He exhaled slowly. Wonderful. Then he heard it. Not screaming. Not growling. Crying. Ethan froze. The sound was quiet. Soft enough that he almost thought the station itself was making the noise. He turned slowly toward the containment window. The armored glass was cracked across one corner, spiderweb fractures spreading through the surface like frozen lightning. Beyond it, hidden inside the dim red emergency glow, sat the figure everyone on the station called a monster. She wasn't what Ethan expected. No claws. No towering beast chained to the wall. Just a girl sitting alone on the floor with her knees pulled tightly against her chest. Her skin shimmered a deep blue-violet beneath the emergency lights. Long silver hair spilled across her shoulders in tangled waves, partially hiding her face. Heavy restraint cuffs wrapped around both wrists, connected to the floor by magnetic anchors. She looked cold. More than cold. Empty. Ethan noticed the untouched food tray near the far wall. Water spilled across the floor beside it, like someone had thrown it from a distance instead of bringing it close. The girl slowly lifted her head. Golden eyes met his through the cracked glass. Ethan had seen fear before. In hospitals. In refugee docks. In the mirror after his wife died. But he had never seen fear look like that. Like someone waiting for the universe to hurt her again. The station clock read 2:13 a.m. when Ethan finally finished recalibrating the oxygen scrubbers outside cell 47. The emergency alarms had stopped 20 minutes earlier, leaving the lower containment level wrapped in an eerie mechanical silence. Only the distant hum of reactor turbines remained, vibrating softly through the floor beneath his boots. Ethan packed away his diagnostic scanner and rubbed a tired hand across his face. He should have left already. Every instinct told him to walk back through the checkpoint doors and forget whatever he had seen inside that chamber. But those golden eyes stayed in his head like a splinter he could not remove. He glanced back toward the containment window. The girl had not moved much. She still sat against the far wall beneath the dim red lights, silver hair falling across one side of her face. The food tray remained untouched. Ethan frowned. Slowly, he unscrewed the lid of his thermal flask. Fresh coffee steam curled upward into the cold, recycled air. The smell filled the corridor instantly, warm and bitter. Human. Normal. Alive. For the first time since entering the lower deck, the station felt less like a prison. Ethan took a careful sip before crouching beside the food tray near the chamber door. He hesitated. Then he picked it up from the floor. Inside the cell, the girl immediately stiffened. Ethan noticed it right away. Her shoulders tightened. Her breathing changed. Like she expected punishment for simply being looked at. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He stepped closer to the reinforced hatch and pressed the manual override for the tray slot. Hydraulic locks hissed softly. The small compartment opened between them. Ethan slid the tray through slowly this time instead of tossing it across the room. He set it carefully near the bench beside her. Not too close. Just close enough that she would not need to crawl for it. Then he stepped back. The girl stared at him in complete silence. Up close, Ethan could see faint silver markings beneath the blue-violet color of her skin, almost like cracked lines glowing under glass. He wondered if they were natural. Or scars. The station database called her Subject V13. Threat level Omega. Species unknown. Possible psychic weapon. But sitting there beneath the flickering lights, she looked less like a weapon and more like somebody who had forgotten what kindness felt like. Ethan leaned against the wall beside the door panel and took another sip of coffee. "You should eat while it is still warm," he said casually. No response. Her golden eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking. "Careful. I am Ethan," he added after a moment. "Maintenance." The girl lowered her gaze slightly, like the sentence confused her. Most people on Helios spoke to her through intercom systems or military commands, not introductions. Ethan checked the cracked ventilation display beside him. Air filtration should stabilize in about an hour, he muttered mostly to himself. Assuming this station does not fall apart first. A tiny sound escaped her then. So quiet Ethan almost missed it. Not laughter exactly. More like surprise trying to remember how to exist. He looked toward her again. "What?" The girl studied him for several long seconds before finally speaking. Her voice sounded softer than he expected. "Careful. Like in used machinery starting for the first time in years." "Why are you talking to me?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Because sitting in silence for 12 hours straight sounds miserable." Another pause. Then she asked something even quieter. "You know what I am?" The question settled heavily between them. Ethan glanced around the empty corridor. The cold steel walls. The blast doors. The restraints attached to the floor. Then back at the girl everyone feared. "Honestly," he said, "right now you mostly look tired." For the first time since Ethan arrived on Deck 9, the fear inside her eyes flickered. Not gone. Just interrupted. Like a crack of light slipping beneath a locked door. By the next cycle, rumors about Ethan had already spread through Deck 9. People stopped talking when he entered maintenance corridors. Security officers watched him too carefully. Even the cafeteria clerk hesitated before handing him his coffee pouch that morning. Helios Station was built above the dead orbit of a frozen mining moon, and nothing traveled faster there than fear. Ethan sat alone at the far corner of the maintenance bay, tightening bolts on a damaged pressure regulator while old ventilation fans rattled overhead. The smell of machine oil and overheated metal filled the air. Across the room, two engineers whispered quietly beside a diagnostic console. They kept glancing toward him. "You actually went inside?" one of them asked. "No suit." Ethan kept working. The ventilation panel was inside. That thing killed a research team on Vega Outpost. Ethan finally looked up. "Did you see it happen?" The engineer hesitated. "No, but everybody knows." Everybody knows. Ethan heard that sentence a lot on Helios. Everybody knew she was dangerous. Everybody knew she could break a person's mind. Everybody knew she was a monster. But nobody seemed to know her name. 3 hours later, Ethan found himself back on the lower containment deck with another maintenance request nobody else wanted. The corridor lights buzzed faintly overhead as he approached Cell 47 carrying a replacement power converter under one arm. The security checkpoint guards looked even more nervous than before. "You again," the older officer muttered. Ethan shrugged. "Apparently the station enjoys catching fire when I take a day off." The younger guard stepped closer. "Listen, something strange happened after you left last night." Ethan paused. "What kind of strange?" Neither guard answered immediately. Finally, the older one lowered his voice. "No psychic spikes. No system disruptions. First quiet night this deck has had in 6 months." Ethan stared at him for a moment before continuing toward the containment hall. The heavy blast door slid open with a hydraulic groan. Cold air rolled out to meet him instantly. Cell 47 looked almost the same as before except for one small detail. The food tray was empty. Ethan noticed it immediately. Every previous tray still sat stacked untouched in the disposal corner behind the containment glass. But not last night's. For some reason, that made him strangely relieved. He knelt beside the damaged floor panel and began replacing the burned converter module. Sparks flickered softly beneath his tools. Behind the glass, he could feel her watching him again. Not hostile, curious, like somebody trying to solve a puzzle. Ethan worked quietly for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. You know, he said while tightening a cable junction, most people stare less aggressively. Silence lingered behind him. Then her soft voice answered. Most people do not stay. Ethan leaned back slightly against the wall panel. Fair point. He finally glanced toward her. She sat closer to the containment window today, though still far enough that the restraint chains remained loose beside her legs. Up close, the faint, glowing lines beneath her skin seemed brighter somehow, pulsing softly beneath the dim, emergency lighting. Her golden eyes followed every movement of his hands. Do you have a name? Ethan asked. The question seemed to surprise her more than anything else he had said. Several seconds passed before she answered quietly. Valeth. Ethan nodded once. That is a pretty name. She blinked slowly at him. Genuine confusion crossed her face. You are strange. Ethan smirked faintly. I got that a lot even before space station monsters started insulting me. For the first time, he saw something shift in her expression. Small, fragile, the beginning of amusement. It disappeared almost immediately, but Ethan caught it. So did she. Valeth lowered her gaze quickly afterward, silver hair falling across her face again. You should not speak to me this way, she whispered. Ethan returned to fixing the panel. Why not? Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bench. Because eventually you will become afraid too. The words did not sound threatening. They sounded tired. Ethan sat quietly for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the repaired ventilation system coming back online above them. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and slid something through the tray compartment beneath the glass. A sealed chocolate protein bar from the cafeteria. Valeth stared at it like he had handed her a piece of another universe. Ethan stood and lifted his toolbox again. For the record, he said casually, terrifying cosmic creatures are usually less polite than you. Then he walked toward the corridor exit while the station lights flickered softly overhead, leaving behind one very confused alien girl holding a chocolate bar like it might break if she breathed too hard. The next time Ethan arrived on Deck 9, somebody had painted a warning across the maintenance corridor wall in thick black letters. Do not talk to Cell 47. The words stretched nearly 6 feet wide beneath the flickering station lights. Ethan stared at them while sipping stale vending machine coffee from a paper cup. Subtle, he muttered. Somewhere above him, the station ventilation system rattled like loose bones inside the walls. Helios was old. Too old for this many secrets. He continued down the corridor anyway. The security checkpoint felt different tonight. Tighter. More armed personnel than usual. 2 additional officers stood near the blast doors with pulse carbines strapped across their chests. One of them scanned Ethan's identification badge twice before allowing him through. You are spending a lot of time down here lately, the officer said carefully. Ethan shrugged. The station keeps breaking. Maybe it should. The officer's expression remained completely serious. Ethan did not answer. The blast doors slid open with a metallic hiss, releasing another wave of cold recycled air from the containment level. But something immediately felt off. The corridor was darker than usual. Half the ceiling lights had burned out, leaving long stretches of shadow between the red emergency strips along the floor. The silence felt heavier too. No alarms. No guard chatter. Just the distant mechanical heartbeat of Helios Station drifting through steel walls. Ethan reached Cell 47 and stopped. Valeth stood near the containment glass. It was the first time he had seen her standing. She was taller than he expected. Nearly 7 feet. Though the slight curve of her posture made her seem smaller somehow. Her silver hair spilled down past her shoulders, glowing faintly beneath the emergency lights. The restraint chains connected to her wrists hung loose tonight, resting quietly against the floor. Her golden eyes met his immediately. She had been waiting for him. Ethan tried not to react to that realization. Good evening to you too, he said lightly as he set down his toolbox beside the wall panel. Valeth tilted her head slightly. You came back. Looks that way. Ethan crouched near the maintenance console and removed the burnt circuit plate he had been assigned to replace. Though apparently somebody upstairs thinks talking to you is a terrible life decision. Valeth lowered her gaze for a moment. They are correct. Ethan glanced toward her through the glass. You really enjoy saying dramatic things, huh? Her expression barely changed, but he noticed the faint glow beneath her skin dim slightly. Sadness, maybe, or embarrassment. It was becoming easier to read her. That thought should have worried him more than it did. Ethan worked quietly for several minutes while sparks crackled softly beneath the open panel. Then, without warning, the corridor lights flickered once and went completely dark. The entire containment level dropped into silence. Ethan froze. Emergency backup systems failed to activate. For a few seconds, the station became nothing but blackness and distant reactor noise. Then he heard it. Breathing. Fast. Uneven. Not his own. Ethan slowly turned toward the containment chamber. In the darkness, Velitha's golden eyes glowed faintly like distant stars. Her voice came quietly from behind the glass. Do not come closer. Ethan frowned. Why? The chains connected to the floor restraints trembled softly. Because when the lights go out, she stopped speaking. Ethan heard metal creak somewhere inside the chamber. Not from force. From tension. Fear. He stepped closer to the glass, despite himself. Velith. Her breathing grew sharper. The faint, glowing lines beneath her skin brightened suddenly beneath the darkness. Silver light moving across her arms like electricity beneath frozen water. Ethan felt something strange then. Not pain. Emotion. A wave of panic brushed against his chest, so suddenly it almost stole his breath. Not his panic. Hers. The realization sent cold air crawling down his spine. Velith pressed herself backward against the far wall, eyes wide with terror. Please leave, she whispered. Before it happens again. Ethan stared at her through the darkness while distant thunder from the reactor core echoed somewhere deep inside the station. Then the emergency lights finally returned in dim red pulses across the chamber. Velith stood completely still beneath them, trembling slightly, as if every muscle in her body hurt from simply existing. Ethan looked down and realized his coffee cup had slipped from his hand during the blackout. Dark liquid spread slowly across the steel floor between them, but he barely noticed. Because for the first time since meeting her, Ethan understood something terrifying. Velith was not afraid of hurting other people. She was afraid of herself. Morales lowered her voice before continuing. 3 guards in the upper security hall collapsed during the blackout. Ethan finally looked up from his tray. Collapsed. She nodded slowly. Panic attacks. One of them started crying in the middle of the corridor and could not explain why. Ethan felt cold metal settle in his stomach. He already knew the answer before Morales said it. They think it was her, she whispered. The cafeteria lights buzzed faintly overhead while workers shuffled through breakfast lines pretending not to listen. But everyone on Helios listened when Cell 47 was mentioned. Ethan pushed his untouched oatmeal aside. Did anybody actually get hurt? Morales hesitated. No. Then maybe people should stop acting like the station survived a war. Morales studied him carefully across the table. You sound protective. Ethan immediately regretted how quickly his heartbeat reacted to that sentence. He stood before she could say anything else. I sound tired. The maintenance lift carried him back toward Deck 9 nearly an hour later. Old hydraulic cables groaned above the elevator ceiling while fluorescent lights flickered weakly against scratched steel walls. Ethan leaned against the side rail with both hands in his jacket pockets, replaying last night inside his head over and over again. The panic he felt during the blackout still clung to him somehow. Not like memory, like residue. By the time the lift doors opened, he already knew he was going. Back to Cell 47 whether it was smart or not. The checkpoint guards barely hid their irritation this time. Again, the younger officer muttered. Ethan handed over his work authorization tablet. Cooling system diagnostics. The older guard narrowed his eyes. Funny how everything on this deck suddenly needs maintenance. Ethan accepted the tablet back. Maybe your terrifying alien ghost keeps breaking things. Neither guard smiled. One of them unlocked the blast doors manually. Do not stay longer than necessary. Ethan entered the containment corridor alone once more. The lower level felt colder than usual tonight. Thin layers of frost had formed near several ventilation grates along the floor, turning the steel walkway slick beneath his boots. Somewhere deep inside the walls, coolant pipes knocked rhythmically like distant thunder. Cell 47 remained dim except for the soft red emergency strips glowing beneath the glass. Velith sat near the window again, though this time she looked weaker somehow. Pale. The glowing silver lines beneath her skin flickered unevenly like damaged circuitry. Ethan frowned immediately. You look awful. Her eyes lifted toward him slowly. That is usually the part where humans become afraid. Ethan set his toolbox down beside the wall and crouched near the maintenance console. I am starting to think humans on this station are dramatic. Valeth watched him silently while he connected a scanner cable into the cooling panel beside the chamber. After a few moments, she spoke again. You should not return here anymore. Ethan kept working. That speech again? I mean it. Her voice sounded weaker than before. People near me begin to feel what I feel. Ethan paused slightly. That explains the guards. Valeth lowered her gaze. Fear spreads quickly inside your species. Ethan stared quietly at the scanner display in his hand, while pieces slowly connected inside his head. Psychic weapon. Emotional surges. Panic attacks. Then he remembered how the blackout felt. Not like someone invading his mind. Like standing too close to a person drowning. He looked back toward her through the glass. You are an empath. Valeth froze. The station suddenly felt very quiet around them. Finally, she answered softly. That word does not exist in your files. Ethan leaned back against the wall beside the console. My wife used to work in neurological rehabilitation before he stopped himself. The old ache still lived inside that sentence. Valeth noticed anyway. Ethan could tell by the sudden shift in her expression. Not curiosity. Sympathy. You lost someone, she said carefully. Ethan exhaled once through his nose. 3 years ago. Valeth remained silent after that. The faint silver glow beneath her skin dimmed lower than before. Ethan realized then that she was not reading thoughts. She was feeling emotion itself. Every fear, every hatred, every grief surrounding her all the time. No walls, no filter, just endless human noise crashing into her nervous system every second of every day. Suddenly, the isolation chamber made horrifying sense. Ethan looked toward the untouched dinner tray beside the wall. Is that why you barely eat? Valeth nodded faintly. Strong emotion makes it worse. Ethan slowly removed his work gloves and stood. Then, before he could overthink it, he walked closer to the containment glass than ever before. Valeth immediately stiffened. Ethan! He sat down quietly on the cold steel floor outside her chamber instead. Not speaking, not staring, just sitting there beside the glass while coolant pipes hummed softly behind the walls. After nearly a minute, Valeth slowly moved closer too, until only the reinforced windows separated them. The silence between them no longer felt empty. And for the first time since arriving on Helios Station, Valeth did not look like someone waiting for the universe to hurt her. 3 nights later, Helios Station lost power again. This time the alarms started before the lights failed. Ethan heard them halfway through replacing a coolant valve near docking ring B. Warning sirens echoed through the station in sharp mechanical bursts, while red emergency lights activated overhead one corridor at a time. Workers abandoned tool carts and hurried toward evacuation routes. Somewhere far above the docking ring, automated station announcements repeated the same sentence over and over. Containment instability detected on Deck 9. All personnel clear lower sectors immediately. Ethan froze with the wrench still in his hand. Deck 9. He was already moving before the announcement finished repeating. The maintenance lift took too long, so he used the emergency stairwells instead, climbing upward through cold steel corridors while warning lights flashed across the walls like distant lightning. By the time he reached the lower containment checkpoint, half the security staff were shouting over each other beside a sealed blast door. What happened? Ethan demanded. One of the guards looked pale beneath the red lights. The psychic dampeners failed during the power surge. Ethan felt his stomach tighten instantly. Is she hurt? The guard stared at him like the question itself was insane. The entire deck is destabilizing. Another alarm suddenly erupted through the corridor. Structural stress warning. Ethan looked toward the containment hall beyond the blast doors. The steel walls were trembling faintly now. Not from explosions. From pressure. Emotional pressure. Fear poured through the corridor, so heavily Ethan could almost taste it in the recycled air. And beneath all of it, hidden underneath the panic of dozens of people, he felt something else. Valeth. Terrified. Ethan stepped toward the sealed door immediately. The older security officer grabbed his arm. Absolutely not. She is alone in there. She is causing this. Ethan yanked his arm free. No. She is drowning in everybody else's fear. The guards exchanged confused looks, but Ethan barely noticed anymore. Because the lights suddenly flickered. Once. Twice. Then everything went dark. This time the blackout lasted longer. Much longer. Somewhere deep in the station, metal screamed. Ethan heard frightened voices echoing through the corridor around him as armed officers backed away from the blast doors instinctively. Then it happened again. Emotion slammed into him like icy water. Terror. Isolation. Pain so overwhelming it almost forced him to his knees. Not his emotions. Hers. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath and pressed one hand against the steel wall beside him. Inside the darkness, he finally understood the horrible truth. Valeth did not attack people intentionally during psychic surges. She absorbed emotion until it crushed her nervous system apart. Fear spread into her, then amplified back outward again like a storm trapped inside a mirror. The station was feeding her panic, and she was feeding it back. "Open the door," Ethan said quietly. "Are you insane?" somebody snapped. Ethan looked toward the black hallway beyond the checkpoint. If nobody calms her down, this whole deck is going to collapse into mass hysteria. Another violent tremor rolled through the corridor beneath their feet. The guards hesitated only 2 seconds before manually unlocking the containment hall. Ethan ran. Emergency lights pulsed weakly along the lower corridor while frost spread across the steel floor beneath his boots. Every overhead light flickered wildly now. Containment panels sparked. Warning sirens distorted through failing speakers. By the time Ethan reached cell 47, the reinforced glass had developed new fractures across its surface. Inside the chamber, Valeth crouched against the far wall, trembling violently. The glowing silver lines beneath her skin burned brighter than Ethan had ever seen before, flooding the chamber with unstable light. The restraint chains attached to the floor shook hard enough to rattle against the steel. Ethan immediately felt the psychic pressure slam into him again. Grief, terror, loneliness, so deep it felt endless. Valeth looked up the moment she sensed him. "No," she whispered weakly. "You should not be here." Ethan stepped closer to the containment glass anyway. "Valeth." The chamber lights exploded overhead in a burst of sparks. Valeth gasped sharply, clutching both sides of her head, as if the station itself was screaming inside her mind. Ethan saw tears streaking down her face beneath the silver glow. "It hurts," she whispered. The words broke something inside him. Because monsters were not supposed to sound afraid. Ethan moved before his brain could argue with the decision. He slammed his emergency maintenance override card against the chamber lock panel beside the door. "Access denied" flashed. Read across the screen. Ethan hit it again harder. "Ethan," Valeth's voice trembled. "Please." Another violent psychic surge crashed through the corridor. Somewhere behind him, distant guards shouted in panic. Ethan ignored all of it. He grabbed the manual release lever with both hands and forced it downward with every ounce of strength he had. Hydraulic locks screamed against the pressure seal. Then the containment door slowly began to open. Cold air rushed outward as the containment chamber door opened 6 inches with a grinding metallic scream. Ethan forced both hands against the emergency lever, muscles straining while warning alarms blared across the corridor behind him. The pressure seal fought him the entire way. Hydraulic pistons hissed violently. Red emergency lights flashed across the steel walls in uneven pulses, bathing everything in the color of a dying heartbeat. Inside the chamber, Valeth stared at him in disbelief. The silver glow beneath her skin flickered wildly now, bright enough to cast trembling reflections across the cracked floor. Ethan could feel the psychic pressure hammering against his chest with every breath he took. Fear, pain, loneliness. It poured off her in waves so powerful the air itself almost seemed heavier around her. And beneath all of it, buried deep inside the chaos, was something worse. Shame. "Ethan," her voice cracked softly. "Please stop." Ethan ignored her. He shoved harder against the manual release lever until the chamber door finally slid open wide enough for him to step through. The moment he crossed the threshold, another psychic surge crashed through the containment level. Lights exploded overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, people shouted in panic. Ethan stumbled sideways against the wall as emotions tore through his nervous system like electrical current. Not thoughts. Feelings. Raw and unfiltered. Terror, so deep it barely felt human anymore. Valeth immediately backed away from him. The restraint chains rattled sharply across the floor behind her. "Do not come closer," she whispered. "I cannot control it." Ethan slowly straightened himself. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. But then he looked at her, really looked at her. Valeth was shaking so badly she could barely remain standing. Tears streaked down her face beneath the unstable silver light flooding through her skin. She did not look dangerous. She looked terrified, like someone trapped inside a nightmare nobody else could hear. Ethan took one slow step forward. Valeth immediately recoiled harder against the far wall. "Why are you still here?" she asked weakly. Ethan swallowed against the pressure crushing inside his chest. "Because you should not have to survive this alone." The words settled into the chamber with strange quietness. Valeth stared at him like she had never heard language used that way before. Another surge rippled outward from her body suddenly, powerful enough that Ethan felt grief slam into him so hard his knees nearly buckled. Images flashed through his mind that were not his own. Crowds screaming, laboratory lights, metal restraints, endless fear surrounding her from every direction. Velith gasped sharply as the psychic wave passed. I am hurting you. Ethan steadied himself against the containment wall. Yeah, he admitted honestly. Little bit. To his surprise, that almost made her laugh through the tears. Almost. The silver glow beneath her skin pulsed again. The chamber temperature dropped several degrees instantly. Frost crept across the walls near the ceiling vents. Ethan realized then that the station was feeding off the emotional storm surrounding her. Every frightened guard outside, every terrified technician, every rumor whispered through Helios. Velith felt all of it at once. And the more afraid people became of her, the more unstable she became in return. A perfect loop of fear. Ethan slowly moved closer again. This time Velith did not back away. Look at me, he said quietly. Her glowing golden eyes lifted toward him. You are not a monster. The words hit her harder than the psychic surges ever had. Ethan saw it happen in real time. Her breathing stopped for half a second. The silver light beneath her skin flickered violently. You do not know what I have done, she whispered. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, but I know what fear does to people. Another tremor rolled through the station beneath their feet. Warning sirens screamed outside the chamber. The containment glass cracked farther across one corner. Ethan barely noticed anymore, because Velith was staring at him now with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Hope. Small. Fragile. Terrified to exist. Ethan carefully raised one hand between them. Not sudden. Not forceful. Just there. An offer. Velith stared at it for several long seconds while silver light trembled across her skin like unstable stars. Then, very slowly, she reached toward him too. The moment her fingers touched his hand, the psychic storm stopped. Not weakened. Stopped. The station lights stabilized instantly overhead. The alarms abruptly fell silent. Even the trembling beneath the floor disappeared. Ethan felt warmth spread through his chest where panic had been moments earlier. Calm. Velith inhaled sharply, like someone surfacing from underwater for the first time in years. Her glowing eyes widened in shock. She whispered softly. I cannot feel the fear anymore. Ethan tightened his hand gently around hers. Good, he said quietly. Then maybe everybody on this station can finally breathe again. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Ethan stood inside the containment chamber with Velith's hand trembling softly in his own while the last echoes of the station alarms faded into silence around them. The silver light beneath her skin slowly dimmed from blinding brightness to a soft, steady glow, like moonlight trapped beneath frozen water. Outside the chamber, emergency crews rushed through the corridor beyond the cracked containment glass, but none of them entered. They were too afraid. Ethan barely noticed anymore, because Velith was staring at him with an expression so fragile it almost hurt to look at. Wonder. How are you doing this? She whispered. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. Honestly, I was hoping you knew. Velith lowered her eyes slowly toward their joined hands. Her breathing had steadied now. The violent trembling in her shoulders was gone. For the first time since Ethan met her, she looked calm. Not controlled. Not restrained. Calm. Like her nervous system had finally stopped screaming. Ethan carefully sat down against the containment wall beside her, still holding her hand loosely between both of his. The chamber felt strangely quiet now without the psychic storm raging through it. Only the distant hum of Helios Station remained beyond the steel walls. Velith spoke again after a long silence. When I was younger, my people believed my abilities were sacred. Ethan glanced toward her. She stared forward at nothing while speaking softly into the dim red light. Empaths were once healers. Mediators. We helped others carry grief. A faint sadness crossed her expression. Then the wars began. Ethan listened quietly. Velith's voice never rose above a whisper, but somehow that made every word heavier. The military discovered we could also absorb fear, rage, pain. The silver glow beneath her skin flickered weakly. Entire battlefields became louder than stars. Ethan felt cold settle into his chest. They turned you into a weapon. Velith nodded once. At first they called it service, then containment, then control. Her fingers tightened slightly around his hand before relaxing again. Eventually they stopped calling me by my name at all. Ethan looked toward the restraint chains lying across the chamber floor. Suddenly he could picture everything too clearly. Laboratories, isolation cells, scientists observing emotional collapse like it was data instead of suffering. You never lost control, Ethan realized quietly. Velith finally looked at him again. Her golden eyes reflected the dim emergency lights like liquid sunlight. No, she whispered. I lost hope. The words sat heavily between them. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose while distant coolant pipes knocked softly behind the walls. So what happened on Vega Outpost? Valeth closed her eyes briefly. Panic. Her voice sounded tired now. There was an equipment failure during a transfer. One guard became afraid. Then another. Their fear spread into me faster than I could contain it. She swallowed carefully. I felt hundreds of minds at once. Terror feeding terror. Ethan already knew the rest. Not because she explained it. Because he had felt a tiny fraction of it himself during the blackout. Enough to understand how horrifying it truly was. Valeth lowered her gaze again. Afterward, they needed someone to blame. Ethan leaned his head back gently against the steel wall behind them. Fear always likes simple answers. Valeth studied him quietly for several seconds. You speak as though you understand loneliness. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. Not happy, just honest. After my wife died, I spent almost 2 years avoiding people. He stared toward the chamber ceiling while speaking. Everybody either pitied me or treated me like I was fragile. Valeth listened silently. One day, Ethan continued. An old mechanic at the shipyard sat beside me during lunch and started complaining about cafeteria coffee for 20 straight minutes. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Did not ask how I was doing. Did not try to fix me. Just sat there like I was still normal. Valeth's expression softened slightly. And that helped. Ethan nodded once. More than therapy, probably. For the first time since Ethan met her, a real smile appeared on Valeth's face. Small, uncertain, but real. It changed her completely. Not because it made her look less alien. Because it made her look less alone. Outside the containment chamber, armed guards slowly gathered beyond the fractured glass, watching nervously through the corridor. Ethan noticed them immediately. So did Valeth. The fragile warmth in her expression faded almost instantly. They are going to separate us, she whispered. Ethan looked toward the guards standing outside with pulse rifles lowered uneasily at their sides. Then back toward Valeth beside him. Yeah, he admitted quietly. Probably. Valeth slowly withdrew her hand from his, though her fingers lingered against his skin for 1 extra second before letting go completely. The chamber suddenly felt colder without the contact between them. Ethan, she whispered softly. He looked toward her. Valeth hesitated like the words themselves frightened her. Then finally she asked the question quietly enough it almost disappeared beneath the station hum. Why were you kind to me? Ethan stared at her for several long seconds beneath the flickering red lights. Then he answered with complete honesty. Because somebody should have been. 6 months later, the coffee machine inside Docking Plaza 7 still made terrible coffee. Ethan stared at the steaming paper cup in his hand with quiet disappointment while rain tapped softly against the curved station windows overhead. The civilian sector of New Carthage Station was louder than Helios ever had been. Merchants shouted across crowded walkways. Cargo drones floated through the air carrying glowing crates between docking terminals. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played soft violin beneath flickering neon signs advertising off-world travel packages and synthetic desserts. It felt alive here. Warm. Human. Ethan liked that. Most days. He leaned against the railing outside the small cafe near Observation Deck C and watched civilian ships drift slowly beyond the massive glass dome overhead. Freighters. Passenger liners. Tiny maintenance craft blinking through the darkness between stars. Ordinary life moving forward. Behind him, the cafe door slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Ethan smiled faintly before even turning around. You are late, he said. The line was very confusing, Valeth answered quietly. Ethan looked over his shoulder. She stood near the doorway holding a small paper bag carefully in both hands like she still did not entirely trust ordinary objects. Her silver hair was shorter now, resting just above her shoulders. The glowing silver lines beneath her blue-violet skin had faded over the past few months too, softer now beneath the warm station lighting. Easier for civilians to ignore. Easier for her to exist. Most importantly, there were no restraint chains attached to her wrists anymore. No containment glass. No armed guards waiting outside every room she entered. Just a tall alien woman wearing an oversized gray coat while trying to understand why humans insisted on putting cinnamon inside baked food. Ethan pushed himself away from the railing as she approached. Please tell me you did not buy another cinnamon roll. Valeth frowned slightly. The old woman at the counter said it was comforting. Ethan took one look at the paper bag and laughed under his breath. That is how they get you. Valeth tilted her head faintly. Humans weaponize sugar. Correct. The faintest smile touched her face. Real smiles came easier now. Not often, but easier. They walked together through the observation hall slowly while crowds moved around them without fear. Some people still stared occasionally. Velith was too tall not to attract attention. But nobody screamed. Nobody ran. Nobody called security. On New Carthage Station, strange species passed through every day. Most civilians simply assumed she was another traveler heading somewhere else. Ethan liked that too. They stopped beside the massive observation window overlooking the stars beyond the station. Velith stood quietly beside him, while silver-blue light from distant ships reflected softly across her eyes. "You still feel them sometimes, do not you?" Ethan asked gently. Velith nodded once. Crowds are loud. Ethan understood immediately. Emotional noise never fully disappeared for her. But after Helios, she had finally learned something important. Feelings could be shared without destroying her. Fear was not the only thing living inside people. She glanced toward him after a moment. "You still visit Helios in your dreams." Ethan smiled tiredly. "You really hate privacy, huh?" "Only accidental privacy violations," she answered softly. Ethan leaned one shoulder lightly against the observation glass beside her. The station shut down after the investigation. Velith remained silent. Turns out illegally isolating psychic empaths inside unstable containment facilities looks bad in court. Velith lowered her gaze slightly. "Many people suffered because of me." Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, many people suffered because nobody tried understanding you sooner." The words settled quietly between them while ships drifted through the darkness outside like slow-moving stars. Velith stared outward through the glass for several long seconds before speaking again. Back on Helios, her voice softened carefully. "When you held my hand," Ethan glanced toward her. Velith's golden eyes reflected the distant station lights now instead of fear. "That was the first time in my life," she whispered, "that another person touched me without hatred." Ethan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. He looked away toward the stars for a moment before answering quietly. "That says more about the galaxy than it does about you." Silence settled between them again. Comfortable silence this time. Warm. Somewhere behind them, the cafe musician began playing a slower song, while rain continued tapping gently against the station dome overhead. Velith carefully opened the paper bag in her hands and held out half of the cinnamon roll toward Ethan. "I still do not understand kindness completely," she admitted softly. Ethan accepted the pastry with a small smile. "Nobody really does." Velith looked back out at the stars beyond the glass while crowded station life moved peacefully around them. Then, very slowly, she rested her head against Ethan's shoulder. No fear, no panic, no psychic storms tearing through steel walls. Just quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy no longer looked at her like a monster.